Hi, welcome to Wetpixel Live. My name is Adam Hanlon. I'm the editor of Wetpixel, and I'm joined by Alex Mustard. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Adam. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. So we were we've been asked a question, and it's someone wanting to upgrade from or to change camera from a Nikon D7200, 7200, which is a crop sensor camera, to a Nikon D850 full frame camera. And we thought this would be an interesting episode because I think quite a few people are in a similar boat. And primarily here talking about what lenses and ports that they're going to need to change in order to get the best out of their new camera system. So Alex, you shoot a D850. What do they need to change over to, or what do they need to look at in order to get the best from their new camera?
I think it's a really interesting topic because I think it's something that a lot of photographers have thought about either hypothetically or have actually had to deal with in changing over. And I think it's quite a common question. I do think there'll be quite a lot of people also asking this question with maybe a view to going over to a full frame mirrorless, going from maybe a crop sensor Canon into a full frame mirrorless Canon, or a crop sensor Nikon SLR into a full frame mirrorless. But the question was specifically 850, which kind of makes a few things easier. Yep. So there are changes. There's a few changes across the board. I would say the main ones are going to be lenses.
Yep.
And the macro is a good place to start because it's where the good news is. The typical Nikon SLR macro shooter is going to own a 60mm and maybe a 105mm macro lens.
Yep.
As a crop sensor shooter, the 60 is probably the lens you use more than the 105.
Yep.
When you move over to full frame, you're going to start using the 105 much more than the 60.
Yep.
But both lenses remain useful.
Yep.
If you own any of the DX only lenses like the 75mm or the 40mm macro lens, those aren't lenses you're likely to want to move across.
Yep.
If you put them on your full frame SLR, it will work like a DX camera.
Yep.
But what's the point in buying a full frame SLR to shoot it as in DX mode? It's just a waste of money and a waste of energy. So I don't see anyone realistically wanting to do that.
Yeah. I think that you may well have both if you have a 105 with your D7200, but equally, so the wet lens, you probably find that you end up using the stronger diopters more. So the Nauticam SMC, the Sub-C plus 10s, those type of wet diopter, you will tend to go with the more magnification diopters than you would with possibly the CMC or that you might have used with or plus 5s that you might have used a lot with the crop sensor cameras. It's not, you may well use both, but I think you'll find
no, but I think it's actually a very, very good point. Is that the very popular combo for a crop sensor shooter is a 60mm and a CMC. Yeah. The very popular for a full frame shooter is a 105 and an SMC.
Yeah.
And I would potentially be selling my CMC2 and buying an SMC1 if I was making that transition. So that is actually a very, very useful point. Then in terms of wide angle, if you were fortunate enough to be shooting your fisheye wide angle on crop sensor with an 8-15, then quid's in. But there's only a few people who are doing that, and they're usually people who've thought about that purchase beforehand. Most people are shooting the 10-17, which you can use as a stopgap, but longer term, you really want to be moving across onto the 8-15 fisheye zoom. That's the best fisheye zoom, both in Canon speak and in Nikon speak for wide angle. But typically, certainly like me, you use that lens a lot of the time just as a straight 15mm. You're not really using the zoom feature on it.
Yeah, so you could. I mean, it would be possible to use something like a Sigma 15mm, which as a prime, as a possibly a less expensive option. That would be a possibility. I think that the 1017, a lot of people do, because the 1017 is this fantastic kind of focal length on crop sensor. You lose some of the advantages of that focal length when you move to full frame. But the other thing that really comes out is particularly with high resolution full frame cameras, the quality on the 1017 is not marvelous actually. You don't notice it when there's less megapixels, but as you get more megapixels, it starts becoming more and more obvious. So again, you're investing all this money in all this extra resolution, and then to some extent throwing some of the resolution away by using a lens that doesn't really do a good job with it. So
maybe for the first 222 where you're building up the system, the 10-17 you just left at the 17 end on full frame is still quite usable, but it's not a good long-term solution. The bad news is the wide angle rectilinear zoom which if you're a Nikon shooter, you've probably got something like a 10 to 24. That's sell that on and buy a 1635. It's not something you can move across with. I think the other bit of pain. Oh, sorry, Adam, you were going to say something.
I think we're probably headed the same way.
Okay,
the other bit
of pain then is dome ports. Is that typically on a crop sensor SLR, you may have been using a mini dome all the time or a 6 to 8 inch dome. On a full frame camera, you really need to be 8 to 9 inch, 9.5 inch dome. So 200 to 230 mil is your main workhorse dome port. It can be worth keeping hold of those old mini domes and things like that to use for extreme types of photos. But if you want to get the most image quality out of your full frame system, those do not want to be your main go-to ports for them. They're too compromised image quality time for too much of the time to want to use them long term.
A possible option at this point, we should mention, and again, this is an expensive option, but WACP does to some extent get around this issue in that you could use WACP with both crop sensor and full frame systems. Obviously, the lens inside will vary, but that does give you the option of switching between the two. Now, is it more expensive than dome port? Yes, it is. But the optical quality as well is arguably certainly easier to use, if not, and is stunning. So that's is another option. So
it's a really good option. If you're fortunate enough to already own a WACP, then that will be a main part of your system. If you're not fortunate enough to already own a WACP1, you might want to strongly look at that instead of going down the 1635 route. And that would so cover both bases. Something else. So that's kind of lens choices. I think we've kind of covered that pretty well. The other thing that obviously it's worth mentioning, again, this is probably more related to high resolution cameras. Bear in mind that you're going to be producing much bigger files. So the hidden cost, bigger memory cards, more storage on your computer, all these things, you want to consider those as well. Hard drives are relatively cheap now. It's not a major expense, but still, you want to factor all that stuff in. Bigger, faster computers, bigger memory cards to store the imagery. So the final thing I wanted to cover is something that people don't often think about in this transition, but I think is actually really critical, is that when you go to full frame shooting and you're shooting wide angle, you're generally having to shoot with the aperture more closed than if you are shooting on a crop sensor. Crop sensor f8, f9, f10 will give you good corner sharpness when shooting wide angle. You need to really be around f13 on a full frame camera to get that same perfect corner sharpness, lovely depth of field through your wide angle images. And the downside of shooting on f13 is everything is a little bit darker. And so you either need to work at higher ISOs, which then is throwing away some of your image quality, just a little bit. Not too big a deal. Or you can add a little bit more strobe power. And I would encourage anyone who's maybe not necessarily got absolute, humdinger flash guns when on their crop sensor system, if they're going to a full frame system, is to think about during the first year or two going up to some really nice wide angle strobes, because they really will transform your work, and they'll allow you to shoot much more comfortably at those more closed apertures that you need to use when working with a full frame camera.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Obviously, it's all about light, isn't it? So at the end of the day, it makes sense. You're investing all this money in image quality, but at the end of the day, the image quality is ultimately just capturing light. So if you haven't got enough of it, you're not going to get the results that you're after. Yeah, it's a really good point. So Alex, you've been shooting. Well, you've shot over the years both systems. So you've got a pretty good representation of both types of image and the lens choice we just discussed on your website. You can, my website amustard.com. I've got an image library on there. It's got about 8,000 processed pictures, and they've all got the metadata of the cameras in them. So you can search for camera models. You can't search crop sensor or full frame, but you can search D 7,000, 100, 200, 7, etc., D2X, D300, D500, etc., to see crop sensor pictures. And then when you see particular shots you like, you can then look at what lens I've used. And I think that can be a really good guide to decide which ones to use. And the same with the full frame cameras. And something else that's worth mentioning, when Alex posts on social media as well, he invariably does post the camera settings and the camera and the lens choices that he's used.
When I remember,
where you do most of the time. You're pretty good at it. So that's also obviously a useful place to look as well. So that's great. Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. I think that's valuable advice. I'd like to thank Aquatica for sponsoring this episode. Please feel free to add any comments for suggestions that you may have about switching between crop sensor and full frame cameras. And drop us a like if you enjoyed this episode. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again soon.